Hey everyone, I will be walking through a case study question that's commonly asked in private equity interviews. Here's the prompt. You're considering opening a coffee shop in New York City. You've done some research and have determined that you'll need to invest $2 million to get started. Please answer the below questions. Would this be a good use of your money? Please estimate annual revenue, profit, and returns. What are some other considerations you would make in evaluating the business? So this question is essentially two-pronged. First, it's asking you to come up with numbers to estimate annual revenue, profit, and returns. And then the second part is asking more qualitatively, what other areas would you have to due diligence before making this investment? So we'll start with the first question and we'll switch over to Excel for this. Because we weren't given any data points around the size of the market, how many people drink coffee in New York, how many customers you have, etc., we'll need to start with a market sizing example. So to get this, essentially what we're going to use the market sizing portion for is to figure out a starting point for a revenue build. So for this example, the starting point of the revenue build will be average customers in the shop per day. So to get to there, we're going to start high level. How many people live in New York City? Right now, I think there are a bit over 8 million people in New York, but as you should do with all of the numbers in your case study question, since you'll likely be doing this on a pen and paper in front of an interviewer live, you should try and simplify. So we're going to simplify that 8 million number to 10 million for the purposes of this. And then of those 10 million people, how many actually drink coffee? We can assume maybe a third of the people in New York are children, a third are working adults, and a third are retired citizens. So maybe we assume none of the children drink coffee, but the majority of adults and senior citizens do. So 50% of residents in New York drink coffee to get to 5 million residents that actually drink coffee. Now, from those 5 million, not all of them are going to buy coffee from a coffee shop every day. Some are going to make coffee at home. Some are going to buy it from the grocery store, get it for free from work. So we'll assume that maybe 50% of those residents actually buy coffee every day from a shop. And that'll give us 2.5 million residents. And then from there, we have to estimate how many customers we'll actually have in the shop that we plan to open. So to get this, we should divide that 2.5 million number by the total number of coffee shops in New York. And let's say there's a coffee shop on every corner of Manhattan. And let's say there are 1,000 coffee shops in Manhattan, and we can replicate that in each of the 5 boroughs. So we'll estimate that there are 5,000 coffee shops total in New York. So to get to our average customers, we'll get 500 customers by dividing the 2.5 million by that 5,000. Now that gives us a starting point for our revenue build. Now, assuming that we have 500 customers per day, how many cups of coffee do they actually buy per day? We can assume each person buys a cup in the morning and a cup in the afternoon. So we're selling approximately 1,000 coffees per day. And let's say each cup is an average of $5, which seems reasonable. So our revenue per day is $5,000. And then how many days are we actually open per year? Again, we want to simplify this number, maybe not 365 days a year, but let's just assume for simplicity and for making the math easier, the coffee shops only open 300 days a year. So we have annual revenue of $1.5 million a year. So now that we have revenue estimated, we're going to come down to expenses. And expenses are two-pronged. So first we have to think about variable expenses, and then we'll move on to fixed expenses. So what expenses are variable? These are the costs associated with actually making the cups of coffee that are sold. So the coffee grounds, any milk, sugar that's put into it, the cups, the lids, the napkins, straws, anything like that. So we're going to estimate that based on a percentage of revenue, as most COGS are. So let's say 50% of revenue goes towards these variable costs. So $750,000 are associated with the actual coffee expenses. From there, we'll move on to fixed costs. And fixed costs I think of in 2 major buckets. Of course, there are tons of other expenses you could include here, but for a basic coffee shop, I'd say the major buckets are labor and then rent expenses for actually renting the store. So we'll start with labor. A coffee shop is pretty small. You don't need super skilled labor to work it. So let's assume you have two people working two registers and then three people in the back actually making coffee for a total of 5 employees. Let's say that they work 10 hours per day and are paid $15 an hour. Since these people are working in a coffee shop, they're likely not getting paid a salary, but more an hourly wage. And then again, we use the same 300 days number that we've used in the revenue build. And then we're going to multiply all of these together to get to annual labor expenses of $225,000 per year. Next, we'll come down to rent expenses. So since we aren't experts on the New York City real estate market, we can just assume that the shop is a certain number of square feet and multiply that by an assumed price per square foot. So let's say the coffee shop's 1,000 square feet. Honestly, kind of big for a coffee shop in New York, but that's what we'll assume. And then the annual expense per square foot is $100 per square foot, which will give you an annual rent expense of $100,000 a year. Again, you could include a ton of different expenses like sales and marketing expenses, utilities, general administration, things like that. But just for simplicity, we're going to assume just these three buckets. And then we're going to add these all up to get to our total annual expenses for the coffee shop of $1,075,000. Now that we have our revenue and expenses, we'll figure out how much our annual profit is. And we'll just bring down the annual revenue of 1.5 million, subtract out annual expenses, and add those two to get to $425,000 of profit in the first year. So to put that into perspective, we're going to pull back the $2 million initial investment that we made. And thinking that we'll divide the $425,000 made in the first year divided by the $2 million initial investment. So the percentage of your initial investment returned in the first year is 21%, which means that you'll pay off your investment in just under the first 5 years. So putting this into perspective, it kind of makes sense. A decent return for the first year and then going on from there. Of course, if you're holding this for a multi-year period, there are things you can do in the following years to try and increase revenue, decrease costs, thus increasing profit, or opening new shops and things like that. But that's kind of how to put this basic example into perspective. Now we'll switch over to the second question. What are some other considerations you would make in evaluating the business? So this is other due diligence areas. So what we went through is essentially kind of the financial due diligence, looking at unit economics, which is a huge part of investing. But flipping to the next page, these are kind of the three other main areas that you'll want to highlight. Of course, there are other areas you could mention, but these are kind of the three big points. So first, the competitive landscape. You have to consider what other players are in this space. Of course, the coffee shop space is a bit crowded. You have the big players like Starbucks, Bluestone Lane, Joe and the Juice, and then you have the smaller mom and pop shops that are open on every corner. So what we'd have to think about is basically if you're opening a coffee shop in New York, the block that you're opening it on, are there other coffee shops? How are you going to win customers away from the Starbucks? Maybe you can't, maybe you have to compete directly with the mom and pop shops. So thinking about that. Additionally, kind of any barriers to entry, like we just saw walking through the basic Excel example, there aren't huge barriers to entry in opening a coffee shop. You basically just have to rent a space and start selling coffee. There are no kind of regulatory hurdles. So very low barriers to entry, which is good for you opening a shop in the space, but also on the flip side, tough if another coffee shop opens up right next to you. And then also just thinking about competitive dynamics. So thinking about how you're going to price coffee, how are you going to try and win against these competitors in this space? Are you going to spend a lot on marketing and advertising, or try and sell cheaper coffee, or maybe have some kind of coffee pass, things like that. The second bullet point is really looking for opportunities to improve the profit margin. So like I said, what we walked through is kind of the base case for the first year, but in private equity investing, you're holding all these businesses for multiple years. So beyond the first year, you likely look to expand the profit margin. And we can do that by cutting costs. So with economies of scale, you're selling, instead of selling 1,000 cups of coffee per day, if you're selling 2,000 cups of coffee per day, you can likely negotiate with your suppliers for lower rates on the coffee grounds, lower rates on the cups, since you're buying more. Same kind of thing with the rent expenses. Maybe you figure out you don't actually need 1,000 square feet. You can cut the space in half and pay half the amount in rent. And then same kind of thing with labor. Maybe you realize you don't need 3 employees making coffee. Maybe you only need 1 running the register, 1 making coffee. So you could cut those costs down as well, which would increase profit margins. And then on the flip side of that, you'd also want to think about ways you can increase revenue. So maybe revenue just happens to grow with the market rate, but you could also run advertising campaigns or special promotions or open up new shops, or expand the space if it's doing really well, things like that. And then finally, you'd want to consider the risks. So risks associated with opening a coffee shop are obviously kind of some of the things we touched on, but competition. Will you be able to win any customers away from the big players in the space? What if rental prices in New York increase drastically after the first year and you're no longer able to cover, your revenue's no longer able to cover even your rent expense alone? Same kind of thing, raising the minimum wage. Is that going to cause you to have to raise prices and be harder to compete with the larger players? Or are you going to have a hard time hiring employees because there are so many coffee shops and maybe you don't have as many benefits? So there are a ton of risks that you can think about as well, and considerations to take into account. Again, everything we discussed isn't an exhaustive list, but is a good foundation whenever you're going through a case study, walking from market sizing down to profit and comparing that to your initial investment, and then looking at kind of these 3 main areas of due diligence, are the main points to hit on in doing this coffee case study.